It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. We are on episode number 240, and it's very late in December. Matter of fact, just a couple of weeks to go, so I'm not sure when the next episode will come out. We've got Christmas and New Year's, family visits planned, things like that, so we'll see. I'll try to get a show out in the next week or so, but it might be early, it might be late, I might skip a week. Who knows? It's my show. I can do whatever I want, I guess. That's the rules. A lot of things coming up. We're going to talk about the alleged birth of Jesus, and how the Bible has signs or things that relate to astronomy and, wandering stars and things like that. And we're going to try to figure that out. And we're going to have an expert, a genuine expert who's written a book about it. But I don't want to spoil all that. We're going to get to that soon enough. Other fun things in my life. I guess the good news, personally, here is that I am not lactose intolerant. The bad news is we still have no idea what's causing my little tummy troubles. We've got a couple other strategies worked out with the doctors. Well, fingers crossed. Hopefully something works out. Other thing, I had mentioned listening to Star Trek Next Generation in Italian in the last few episodes, and I had made some comment about dubbing being different than subtitles. Got a lot of email about that. I have the most intelligent listeners. They walked me through and explained it. And the basic short for you, the listener, who may not really give a shit about all this detail, but I thought it was fascinating. The dubbing, if done well, often tries to match the cadence of the characters, the cadence of the lines spoken in the original language, and of course, if possible, even the look of the mouth, so that the sounds make sense, so you don't notice it like one of those old Japanese monster movies where they dub it in English without any attention to what the sounds might have looked like. So there's that. And then the subtitles often have to fit within the screen or within timing of how fast you read it versus how much time you have in that scene before it changes to the next scene. So very different agendas and criteria going on there, which is why they're probably not going to match, but it still cracks me up. And I guess it's a good sign that I know enough Italian to notice the difference. Other things with Star Trek, while we're on it, people have asked me a lot of things about what does it sound like when certain things are said. And the most common one, to no surprise to me at all, is what do the Borg sound like when they say resistance is futile? I don't know yet. I haven't got there. I'll keep you posted. Another one people wanted to ask me is what happens when the captain says engage. What it actually says is attivare, or the Italian verb to activate. So that, it makes sense, but it's a little different. So it's attivare. So, I'll keep you posted on fun things I learn about Star Trek dubbed in Italian. The other thing that I found really kind of annoying, and I'm having trouble with it, is that for whatever reason, they'd made an executive decision in the dubbing into Italian that they are going to call Data. And so his name is Data, and I watched one of the documentaries that came with the discs that talked about that very debate they had in English and ended up going with Data. And there's an actual episode where Data has a discussion with somebody over his name and, again, says that it's Data, not Data. But in the Italian, it's Data, not Data. And they even had that episode where there was this discussion. They flipped it all backwards. And, it was just driving me nuts because I knew that's not his name. So That's just kind of one of those weird little things. So anyway, coming up, I'm going to be on a couple of different podcasts. I've got a lot of requests to be interviewed on podcasts, talking about year-end financing stuff and Bitcoin fun. So we have that to look forward to. I will be appearing soon on Cellar Door Skeptics and a show called Naked Diner. And on Naked Diner, it was decided that what I engage in is fact-fucking people. And it made me think about many years ago, I had a talk scheduled at a Christian women's group. And when they asked what I would talk about, I explained to them about ripoffs and scams and everything. And they canceled my appearance. It had nothing to do with religion, which is hysterical. Well, I guess it kind of does in a way. But they were concerned that I might be telling some of the members in the audience that their investments are awful. And that some of the people in the group were older women, not too old compared to me, but 60, 70, or even in their 80s or beyond. And that if I were to tell them that they had terrible investments, they might have to face the recognition that they maybe have had this terrible investment for decades, and they can't fix that. So why tell them how awful it is? I thought that was a very interesting thing, and it's also one of those things that we as humans sometimes entrench ourselves and are even less likely to accept correction. And I've been having some fun with that on my Facebook wall about Bitcoin. And one of the reasons I've been asked on so many shows lately, and I might even be on another 3 or 4 before the month is out, is my position on Bitcoin, that it is a bubble. And I've had multiple people that I know, people that are secular, non-religious, atheists even, and people that are very, very smart, making incredibly humorous arguments that are a lot like religion in a way. As an example, I asked one person to provide me some documentation, some evidence that Bitcoin is actually worth what it's trading for. And they sent me a screenshot of the trading activity for today to show me what the quoted price was. And I'm trying to now explain to them that that's the trading price. That's not the underlying value. So, for example, if you look at a stock in a company that might be currently trading for $42, you could, at least theoretically, someone could, Warren Buffett can and other people can, go through and try to calculate what that company might be worth. Now, there's a lot of room for error, which is why it's very, very difficult to do. But you can come up with some kind of estimated number, and you can do it on cash flow, you can do it on revenue, you can do it on assets that they own, you can do it on projected future income. There's all kinds of ways you can value a company, but you can come up with some number based on something. And if you think the company is worth considerably more than the price of the individual shares, you would be motivated to buy them. If you think the company is dramatically lower in value than the shares would indicate, you could sell them. So that doesn't seem to translate when I'm talking to people in Bitcoin because, like I said, they just wanted to send me a screenshot of the trading price. And I said, the trading price is not the value. That's the trading price. Anyone that has ever reviewed an individual stock knows that those two aren't necessarily and often aren't the same on purpose. I was also asked if I thought that Bitcoin was a lot like the tulip bulb mania in Dutchland, Netherlands, I guess. I'm not sure what to call that country, so forgive me, dear listeners. If you're in that area, send me an email, correct me. Tulip bulb mania in the early 1600s. And I said, well, there is one big difference. With the tulip bulb, you can plant it and get a flower. So I'm still very, very concerned about Bitcoin and the fact that it is a bubble. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that I think Bitcoin is worth zero, although I'm open to that argument. But I will point out that a lot of really, really smart people who know a lot about investing in the long run have a position similar to mine, which maybe is an appeal to authority and is a fallacious argument in itself. But I did find it amusing. John C. Bogle, one of my heroes, who started the Vanguard Mutual Fund Company and wrote my favorite book, which actually we're going to get into books here in a minute. He recently said, "Avoid Bitcoin like the plague." Did I make myself clear? I thought that was very, very to the point. So Not into Bitcoin. That's me. Not into Bitcoin. Not interested in it. I also had someone point out that it's gone up 2,000% in the last year. So therefore, I have an obligation to recommend 5 to 10% of all of my clients' assets be put in Bitcoin, which I think is absolutely fallacious and it's ridiculous. And it's just like if I bet on a horse and I bet $1 and I get $20 back, I just made a 2,000% return, wink, wink, air quotes, doesn't make it an investment. And even if I bet on that horse and again win $20 for my $1 bet, doesn't prove that I'm right in calling it an investment. It means I won a second bet. So there are things that are investments and there are things that aren't. So enough of that. In reference to books, this is something I get asked a lot. I haven't talked about it on the show lately. So I have only 3 books that I recommend in general to learn more about investing. The first one is the starter book, and it's first, especially for people that are having trouble saving money, haven't saved much money, or haven't really started, don't understand even how to start. That book is called The Richest Man in Babylon. It is out of copyright, so it's really cheap. It's like $5. You can get it in Audible. You can get it in paperback. Maybe you can even find it in hardback. You can get it in Kindle for $1.99 or something like that. Really affordable, really valuable. I highly recommend that book to anyone that's getting started, or even if you're an advanced investor, because it's a fun book. It really is. It is cheesy and over the top and campy and can get a little repetitive. And since it's talking about the olden days in Babylon and was written probably 100 years ago, it is terribly sexist. So keep that in mind. It's got some parts that we would consider unacceptable today, but if you just kind of ignore that bit and just listen to the financial advice, it makes a lot of sense. And then once you've started saving some money, you're dabbling in investing, but you don't really know what you're doing, A Random Walk Down Wall Street is my second book. A Random Walk Down Wall Street, I think it was first published in 1974, and every 5 to 8 years they come out with a new version. You do want to get something in the last decade or so, because things change in the book, which is really nice. And it goes through, this is a stock, this is a bond, here's how bonds work, here's how stocks work, here's mutual funds, here's insurance, and here's annuities. I would probably, without thinking about it real hard, agree with 90% plus in that book. It's very valuable as far as a broad spectrum understanding of a lot of investing things. So I highly recommend that as the second book. Again, A Random Walk Down Wall Street. The third book in this trinity, oh, is that fair? Is Common Sense on Mutual Funds. Again, this was written by the founder of Vanguard, John C. Bogle, who I talked about with Bitcoin just a few minutes ago. This book is a challenge. It's not Harry Potter. It's not a Dan Brown novel. You can't, well, I recommend that you do not sit down and just read it. You're not going to absorb it. This is heavy and complicated stuff. And I think you should treat it as a textbook. So if you know an awful lot about investing and you've been doing it for a while and you've been successful, maybe you can read this in a few weeks. But if you're new to a lot of this, it might take longer, a lot longer. And I wouldn't be bothered by that. I wouldn't be bothered by it at all if it took you 12 to 18 months to get through this book. You want to learn the content that it has in it, not finish a reading race. It's not who gets to the end the fastest. It's about understanding the stuff that's in it. It has a lot of charts, tables, data, a lot of information, statistical analysis, and I consider it my investing Bible, and I look back to it all the time. I recommend against getting it on Kindle or an audiobook, and I, again, strongly encourage that you do get it in hardback form and treat it like a textbook. Take your time, but if you understand the majority of this book, you're going to beat the vast majority of all investors. So those are my 3 book recommendations. Still got a couple more little cleanup things here from email. I want to get to them real quick here. One is about 401ks. My general advice, and I've had whole segments on this, so this is just going to be really short. And if you want a whole segment on it, I can do it again. if you have an old 401k from an old employer, you should roll it over as soon as convenient. Do not let it stay around. I have had clients come to me that their former employer has eventually gone bankrupt, and it becomes a very difficult challenge to figure out how to move the 401k. Plus, you often have way more options. I shouldn't use that word. Way more choices to invest the money if you move it from the 401k to an IRA and you manage it yourself or have an advisor help you. One of the other problems, of course, if the old employer decides to move from a good 401k provider to a really shitty one, your investments will be moved. They usually call it mapping. They'll be mapped from what they are to what they're going to be. And you could end up with downright sucky investments, even if you had good ones when you left. You will have no control over that. So if they switch the plan, your investments will switch also. I had an email from somebody asking how they could get into the business and do kind of what I do. Well, the first thing is you need to pass a test called the Series 65 licensing exam. I'm assuming you can do that in any state. That's the one that I have. And it doesn't mean you know a whole lot. It just means you pass the test. But that's the minimum. That's where you've got to start. I would recommend that you incorporate, get an LLC or an S Corp, depending on what your CPA and attorney recommend to you. And then you're going to need to hire somebody to help you go through and setting up the legal process of your business and the registration with the government, because there's a lot of freaking rules. And I know that the rules are often there for a reason, but some of them are just painful. So that's something I have to do every year. And I did it on my own for years. And you can do it on your own. But I've gotten big enough that I now have a company that helps me with it every year. And I don't think I'm ever going to go back to doing it on my own. So that's something you can do. So, you'd have to pass the test. You'd have to incorporate in some way. And you'd have to pay. And all of this might cost you $10,000, $12,000, $15,000, depending on your state and what you want to set up. But you could technically be a licensed financial advisor. Not that that's worth anything, but that's kind of how you would get started. If you're interested in learning more, you can contact me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. Of course, just passing a test doesn't mean you actually know how all this stuff works, but those are the legal requirements of how to do it. Another thought someone had, I forgot to mention with the 401k check, when you move a 401k, or if you want to close your 401k, the first thing you should do is set up an IRA account somewhere for the money to go into. Once you've done that, you contact your old employer, and this is the same for a 401k or a 403b, and you tell them that you want to roll the money over into an IRA. They'll either send you a form or they'll send you a link online and you'll be able to fill it out there. Some companies, it is literally one page, and sometimes it's even just tell us who we're sending the check to and the account number. But I've also had companies that send an 8-page document and it gets all confusing as fuck. And it doesn't need to be that way, but some people love to make forms. And once you've given them the information and done whatever you have to, the former employer will likely, 99%, send a check to you. It will be made out to the custodian. So I use TD Ameritrade as the qualified custodian. So the check might say TD Ameritrade FBO for the benefit of Phil Ferguson, and they'll mail it to me. And then I would have to get that check, look at the check and go, oh, that's a lovely check. And the really important thing, is it the right amount? Is it what you thought you were going to get? Because I think once you send that check in to the custodian, and again, in my example, to TD Ameritrade, they're going to deposit in your account and you're done, right? Now you've just got to figure out what to invest it in. So, that's just some basics about how a 401k would work. If you have more questions, again, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. The other thing I had, and I know this is a lot, but I had a lot of things come up in the last week or so. I want to talk a few minutes about something that I got sent. I get emails. I get lots and lots of emails from companies that want me to sell stuff. And some of it is packaged in such a way that it sounds really sexy. I mean, people have a job, and it is their obligation to convince me and you to buy something. So I guess it's not a surprise that they're pretty darn good at their job. And sometimes I see them and I crack up. It's just amazing how bad these investments are, or how tricky they're being with the language, and not necessarily anything untruthful, but maybe a little more creative than they should be in describing it. And this one jumped to, I don't know, just jumped out at me. And so I wanted to tell you about it. It's called BTS Tactical Fixed Income Fund. And tactical investment philosophy, we've talked about in the past. It is generally some kind of mathematical calculation or some formula to decide when to jump in and out of different things. I've done whole shows on it. And again, if you want me to, let me know. I'll do it again. I've got a lot of new listeners, and maybe I can do a fresh take on it, whatever. But this one is all bonds, so we know that. But it can jump from the most conservative of U.S. government bonds and then switch to cash overnight or the next day. And then a week later, it can switch to 100% high yield, also known as junk bond. So when you're trying to figure out where your investments are held, this makes it really, really impossible, because if you put 10% of your money in this fund, you could have 10% in junk bonds, which is higher than I recommend. You could have 10% in cash, generally higher than I recommend. And maybe you have some other government bond funds, and so you might have 10% one day and 20% the next day in U.S. government bonds. You don't know what you own because you've bought a fund that can switch like crazy. So I just wanted to go over some basic facts of what they presented and talk about some other details. So one of the ideas with any tactical fund, and it's something that you should have, your ears should perk up if you hear things like this, that you're going to get the vast majority of the benefit, and when things go bad, we're going to protect you. I mean, that's the general sense. Within stock tactical, they'll say you'll get most of the market returns, but we're going to cover you when the market goes down, or we're going to protect you when the market goes down, or what was this other phrase that they often use here? Hang on a second. The downside capture. So when the market goes down 10%, you're only going to lose 4%. So, they'll talk about things like that. Since this fund can jump into, and it appears that it often is a junk bond fund because that's where the high returns are, fine. I'm not opposed to junk bond funds on their own. I think they should be a limited portion of your portfolio. But unfortunately, this fund, in the glossy documents that they gave me that I could hand to a client, or the documents that they make for a client, all compare it to a general bond index. It's called the Barclays Aggregate Bond Index, which is a combination of different types of bond, generally not including emerging market bonds, generally not including municipal bonds because they're different, and not including junk bonds, again, because they're different. Just general run-of-the-mill corporate and government bonds. Long-term, short-term stuff, a good mix of things. So to compare something that's taking a lot of risk to a portfolio that's not taking a lot of risk is disingenuous. I'll go with that. It's unfortunate. They know better. They know what they're doing. They're comparing it to something that is considerably more conservative to show you how well that they've done. That pisses me off. It's not a fair comparison. So I'm going to look at how this compares to the Vanguard High Yield, aka Junk Bond Fund at Vanguard. So here's some of the things. So for example, if you buy the A shares, you have a 5% load, and the expense ratio is 1.9%, almost 2% per year. So if you spread out the 5% load to 0.5% per year, and it's actually worse than that, but we're going to be rounding here, and the expense ratio is about 2%, you have to beat junk bonds by 2.5% for this fund to match junk bonds. The Vanguard Junk Bond Admiral shares are 0.13%. So you have 2.5 versus 0.13. The yield on this is 3.54 currently, and I looked this all up on Morningstar.com, and you can too. The Vanguard Junk Bond Fund is 4.8. So its yield is actually lower than the Vanguard fund. Year to date, this calendar year, the fund has made about 3%, and the Vanguard fund has made about 7%. In 2016, it made almost 14%, and the Vanguard fund made 11%. And in 15, the fund lost 2%, and the Vanguard fund lost 1.3%. So they're both relatively volatile for bond funds. They go up considerably, they go down considerably. And when you look at the 10-year period, you can see that this fund has averaged 7.978%, while the Vanguard fund is 6.95 or 7%. So it's like, really, is that what they've actually looked? And again, I was on Morningstar.com, and the data only goes back 3.5 years. Well, how do they have 10-year-old data? And my first thought, again, was that this was back-tested data, where they made a bunch of assumptions and said, if I had done this, if I had done that, magically I would have made this amount, which is complete bullshit. But it's not what they did. This actually has only been a bond fund for 3.5 years, give or take, 4 years. And before that, it was a private LLC that you had to buy ownership in. And so it transformed from a LLC that was doing this rapid trading of bonds into a mutual fund. I'm not real comfortable with that transition. I'm not real comfortable comparing that data. But whatever. Past performance is no guarantee of future results kind of thing. So I don't think this is anywhere near as good as just owning the Vanguard junk bond fund. So, I mean, if you want the excitement of high returns in a bond, just get that. Another big difference between these two funds, and this is really important if you are in a taxable account. It doesn't matter so much in an IRA or a 401k, but if you're in a taxable account, the fund has 100%, 180% turnover, where the Vanguard high yield junk bond fund has 26% turnover. And the reason that that is important is because sometimes bond funds can go up materially or down materially in a given calendar year. And matter of fact, in 2008, junk bond funds went down a lot. In 2009, they went up a lot. So depending on when you buy it, you might not only have the dividends, but a capital appreciation or a capital loss. If the fund is trading a lot, and 180% turnover in a year is a lot, virtually all of your gains are going to be taxed at your marginal rate. And if you're making a good amount of income, that might be 25, 28, or 33%. Whereas part of it in the Vanguard fund is going to be appreciation, which can compound, or when you sell something, be taxed at the long-term rate, which is likely for you going to be 15%. So it can be a really, really big advantage in a stock fund. In a bond fund, it's not as important, but it still helps. So again, it just was a lot of glossy presentation and a lot of fancy words about how wonderful this fund is. But when I look at the data, when I look at the cost structure especially, and the fact that I don't believe in the philosophy of tactical investing, and we could have a discussion about that, but I don't think it's a good place to put your money. Anyway, more time than I wanted to spend, a lot of stuff going on. Next week, I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why index funds are good. So I wanted to get a lot of this stuff in today because the next show is probably going to be pretty close to one big topic, the value of index funds and why index funds versus not index funds. So listen to that. Hopefully you'll enjoy that. We'll take a little break and we'll come back and we'll talk about the birth of Jesus Christ.
How do we justify, as it were, faith that science will give us the truth? It works. Planes fly, cars drive, computers compute.
It's an inductive argument.
If you base medicine on science, you cure people. If you base the design of planes on science, they fly. If you base the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. It works. Bitches.
All right, everybody. Welcome back. Of course, this is Phil Ferguson, and you are still listening to the cleverly titled Phil Ferguson Show. With me today, I have Aaron Adair, and he is going to talk about the Star of Bethlehem. It's a nice Christmas special. Aaron, how are you, sir?
I am doing wonderful. Thank you for having me.
And is Aaron a biblical name of some kind?
Yeah, I think there was some guy who knew a guy that was named Aaron. I think he was like, oh, yeah, that brother of, what was his name? Moses, there we go.
Yeah. Didn't he take over after he killed Moses? I mean, after Moses died, it was a hit job, inside job.
Well, he did all the speaking anyways. I mean, the story says Moses sucked at public speaking, so Aaron had to do it all.
Well, it's good to have family in those situations, so that's nice.
Yeah, just don't be Moses' sister. Get angry, then God will punish you. That's what happens. That's the story, at least.
Well, and of course, Moses' son had a fun incident with his mother.
Oh, yeah. Nobody knows what the hell happened there.
Was that the original foreshadowing? Ooh, that
one cuts a little deep.
That's a little obtuse. We'll see how many listeners figure that out. We're going to talk some Bible today, and of course, we're just in time for the holidays, right? We're going to call this a Christmas special. How's that sound?
Sounds fantastic. Most seasonal.
Most seasonal. And of course, for my listeners, if they don't know you, which is a crying shame, you have written a book called The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View.
Yes, and we need more of the skeptical view out there. So I've been pushing this project for a long time. It's been something I've been researching. Wow, I just ran the numbers in my head, 14 years.
That does seem like a long time to be studying something like this. Now, of course, we have the book, and I see it. I'm looking at the Amazon page. It's in Kindle and paperback. Sadly, not in audio, so I didn't get a chance to listen to it, so my apologies. But I have covered the topic a little bit in the past on my own, so hopefully I can keep up with you.
Fortunately, it's a topic that doesn't evolve too quickly. In a sense, we've been discussing the same points for the last, quite literally, 200 years.
I do remember going to the occasional planetarium show where, there was a presentation about the star and the story, and it's something that brings in crowds. And it always seemed like a whole lot of conjecture with no real fact behind it. And of course, if you try, because my listeners may not know, and again, if I make mistakes, because you know some things about astronomy, right?
Yes, I actually have a degree in the subject and a PhD in physics.
Excellent. So it's not like you're just a dude off the street. You've actually studied a little bit. We can look at star placements and planet placements, and we have very fancy schmancy formulas, and we can kind of run them backwards in time and know where everything was at a certain fixed date back in time. Is that correct?
It's absolutely true for the planets and the stars. We have immensely good models of where they were in the past, and heck, we can even double check them based on, say, Babylonian records, because those go back thousands of years. Things we may not know so well, like if there was a meteor in the sky at a certain place in time, comets might be a bit iffy. For those, we're still reliant on any old historical record, and those can be spotty. But if the planets, the stars, the moon, we know where they are located with nearly perfect accuracy in the past. Excellent.
I'm delighted to hear that. And of course, I would like to, before we get into the Star of Bethlehem too much, did I understand correctly, you grew up Catholic, is that correct?
That was my background, and gone through First Communion, didn't get through confirmation in part because I think the rest of my family just got tired of going. And for the longest time, until I was in college, I think the best label for me was Catholic deist.
Catholic deist. And what would you consider yourself now? Because I don't want to put the label upon you.
Skeptic, atheist, non-believer, those are the best terms, yeah.
Those will all work for you.
All work fine.
And at what point did you transition from Catholic deist, which is kind of comical in and of itself, I think, to full-blown atheist? How'd that happen?
Well, I can actually pin it to a particular night because I had been
nice. Did you see the Star of Bethlehem?
No, it was basically, I actually gone to a debate with one of the proponents, I forget his name, but he was a televangelist who, for whatever reason, his side profile looks exactly like Senator John Kerry. But I forget the guy's name. And then the atheist was Michael Newdown, famous for arguing in front of the Supreme Court about Pledge of Allegiance issues, things like that.
Indeed.
And while I didn't think Newdown had a spectacular presentation, I was just so flabbergasted by how honestly shitty the other argument was that I was like, yep, I got no reason. I'm an atheist.
And how old were you when this happened?
Oh, I was in college, so not quite 21 yet.
Okay, because I know one of the things that kind of threw me over the cliff, I guess. I was 13 and I was in confirmation to become Methodist, and I thought I had pretty straightforward and simple questions. And the learned minister who, had gone through college and seminary and was 40 plus years old, couldn't answer the questions of a 13-year-old. That really kind of boggled my mind, and I'm like, I don't understand. These should be easy things for you to answer. Why is it so complicated?
Everything from where did Cain get his wife to the conflicting genealogies of Jesus to shouldn't Jesus be back by now?
Well, it's interesting, the overlap, because my original intended degree when I went to university was astronomy. So I do know some things about astronomy. I ended up switching amazingly to physics, and then dropping that altogether and limping out of college on a psych degree because I could finish that very easily without doing any work, unlike the continuing in physics. So I do know some things about it, but you've got this book, and it's called The Star of Bethlehem. So let me give you the softball question. Was there such a star? I mean, is this even mathematically possible? Did the models say this is going to work?
If you're going to say there was such a star, the question is it one that actually matches the description from the story? So you got to go back to the original source, which is the Gospel of Matthew. 2nd chapter has this story about these often translated wise men. The original Greek says magi, who come around and say, hey, we saw this star. We figured we better come and worship the new king of the Jews, and have this star guide them, as the original Greek of the language indicates, to a very particular house hovering over there, basically pointing at it like it's a GPS unit. Does anything in the sky match that at all? No, no, no.
Yeah, because that kind of ruins most of the other possible explanations right off the bat. So, we're going to have a hard time doing a whole hour on this. But, a star or even a supernova, they will maintain a fixed position in the sky and rotate from east to west like the sun and the moon do, and rise and set. They're not going to just kind of hang out over a house, right?
Exactly, yeah. They're going to be just like every other star in the sky and drift from east to west, just doing normal stellar motion. So a supernova stands over a particular house just as well as any other star, and it's a terrible way to do navigation, quite frankly. Yeah,
because, there is one star that doesn't move very much. I happen to know that name very well, and I used it for the name of my company. That's Polaris. Could it have been Polaris or something way north that's a supernova? But that's really not rising in the east, though, is it?
Yeah, that's part of the description is that, and even there, this is one point where there's still a fair bit of debate on the interpretation. Most of the Greek is easy enough to translate. In fact, I did it myself. I translated the 12 verses of the bit of story personally in my own book, The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View, now available on Amazon. But the one part that there's still some debate on is the phrase "in the east." More modern translations say "at its rising." It's a bit ambiguous because the Greek word literally means rise or rising. But where do stars rise? In the east.
Of course, yeah.
Therefore, it's a little ambiguous that way.
Well, it clearly ambiguous, but, we get the gist that it had to come from the east, and maybe it rose, and, okay, we're splitting hairs here, but so it came up from the horizon, probably in the east, and then stalled out, which is not any kind of star. And, of course, Polaris, no matter where you are on the planet, except for maybe the equator, but even then it doesn't rise because it stays north until you can't see it and you're too far south. So that kind of leads us to other things like maybe comet. Is that going to work? Can a comet just kind of hang there?
Well, there are some descriptions that make it sound like a comet can like hang over a particular city. The Jewish historian Josephus described a comet and a sword-shaped star hanging over Jerusalem basically just before the Romans came in and basically leveled the temple and the city itself. But this was also when Josephus is talking about how the doors of the temple just swung themselves open and how a cow gave birth to a lamb and all sorts of other weird stuff all happening at once. So if the only time comets can stand over cities is when basically all hell is breaking loose, including the laws of physics breaking loose.
Right.
Not the best description. And also, far more often than not, comets in ancient astrological beliefs is that it's bad news. The Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, more often than not, when they pointed to a comet, they said, oh shit, here comes a pestilence, here comes a war, oh, the king is dead. Not, woohoo, new king. Great times.
Well, and of course, every group can interpret it differently. And I don't know if you've watched Game of Thrones. Listeners, spoiler alert. There is a scene later on in the series where there is a comet. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yes.
And of course, every different group of people interpret the meaning of this comet differently. So,
same thing in antiquity. There's actually an interesting little story with the Emperor Vespasian, one of the Roman emperors who was also responsible for the sacking of Jerusalem. And towards the end of his reign, a comet was seen in the sky, and everyone's like, oh no, this is really bad news for the emperor. But Vespasian's like, no, you don't have to worry, because this is actually a prophecy for the Persian king, because the word for comet comes from the Latin coma, which means head and hairy. And Vespasian's like, well, the Persian king, he's hairy, and I'm completely bald, so the comet has nothing to do with me.
Very nice.
He died a few months later.
Yeah, that's awkward as fuck. Now, if I understand, and again, this is something that you can help me with, wasn't a kind of a bright object in the sky a literary thing used? It's what is it, Aeneas? Was there a story that had this kind of motif before?
Yeah, it's probably one of the closest literary motifs that's influencing things. So in the story, this is taking place not long after the Trojans have been defeated by the Greeks, and the remaining Trojans are basically trying to escape. And Aeneas' father makes this supplication to the gods, basically saying, help us, give us a sign. And then basically this comet-like star comes zipping across the sky, pretty much pointing them in the direction of where they're going to go and find their new homeland. But, of course, this is all invention on the part of the poet Virgil centuries after the alleged time this even happened, and he's also modifying the story because originally this was just a star, but it was made more comet-like because, well, there was a comet considered to be very important, and it was claimed to be the actual soul of Julius Caesar rising up. So Virgil is basically combining a little bit of Julius Caesar divination or becoming divine, and the older story of Aeneas being guided to the homeland by a star.
So are you implying that 2,000 years ago, not every story was literally true? It might actually just be for entertainment or predictive purposes or something?
Oh, yeah. They told plenty of whoppers and sometimes had a whole lot of fun with it. One of the best cases I could think of, second century piece of literature called True History by Lucian. And first major line in there says, like, everything in the only true statement of this thing is that everything in here is a lie.
Oh, very, very nice. I guess.
And it includes in things such as a ship going onto the Atlantic Ocean, being shot up into space and landing on the moon, and the Greeks popping out there, becoming kings of the moon and fighting a giant war between giant spiders and cabbage people from Saturn and Venus and whatever. It's weird.
That is odd. So, if we can eliminate all these celestial bodies, I guess and I'm not saying it's UFOs, but we're pretty much left with a UFO, right? Is that what happened?
It's somewhat frightening to think that two things. One, it's an extremely popular option out there. And secondly, it happens to fit the description the best compared to the astronomical objects, because at least a ship can fly around and hover over particular locations and give some sort of guidance. Though, frankly, why the author would refer to this ship as a star and not a ship is, a little bit of question begging. And also, why would aliens from some other galaxy or some other star system come around and just want to mess around with the local Palestinians? I'm not quite sure.
Well, it's the old joke, Jesus is my space daddy, and maybe this is really the case. But I jest, of course. Now, you got interested in this subject, and why this subject? I mean, what compels you, and what do you hope to gain from this? The complete and utter destruction of Christianity?
That would be an ambitious goal from this angle, but I'll start from how I got interested in it and why it continues to be interesting. So when I started my undergrad studies at Michigan State University, I was able to get a job as a show presenter at the planetarium there. And it was a nice gig, and weekends I would present the show, do the star talk, usually not screw up. And come Christmas time, the seasonal show included a section about astronomical or astrological explanations for what the Star of Bethlehem might have been. That's the first time I remember seeing this idea, and I was like, wow, this sounded really good, and it fit my own theology. Like I said, I was still a Catholic deist at the time, so the idea is straightforward laws of motion giving rise to this predictably happening that we can verify with science, and it shows a biblical miracle. Wow, perfect, great, excellent. Then I remember going home, watching a TV special, and they presented a different theory and said, this is the real Star of Bethlehem. And I'm like, huh? These are different. In fact, they don't even agree on when Jesus was born. They actually give completely different dates than when he had to have been born. I was
going to go into that in a few minutes, but you're right. I mean, of course, we're all assuming up to this point that we're talking about a very known and certain date, but there's quite a wiggle room of, 10, 15, 20 years there maybe or more?
It depends on what sources you want. The first attempts to really use astronomy to pin down when Jesus was born was actually done by the great astronomer Johannes Kepler. He first off figured out that actually the calendars were wrong based on other people's scholarship, and he built on that, and then also included some astronomical arguments for when Jesus had to have been born based on, he figured, the Star of Bethlehem had to have happened after these great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn because they were so astrologically interesting.
Well, of course.
Yeah. Of course, nowadays we consider that line of argument to be, kind of bullshit, but nonetheless, that was some of the early attempts. But depending on the sources you want, the Gospel of Matthew implies that Jesus is born sometime before the death of King Herod the Great. We know he died no later than 4 BCE. And because Jesus is only supposed to be a couple years old, the context implies he must have been born within a few years of Herod's death. So say no earlier than, say, 8 BC at the absolute earliest. On the other hand, if you switch to the Gospel of Luke, it's a different story, and Jesus is coming in during the census, which we know took place in 6 and 7 AD, so it doesn't match up. There's at least a 10-year contradiction. And that's only if you care about the canonical sources. There are other sources that indicate that Jesus was born a century earlier. Oops.
Wow, that I'm not aware of those. Is that what books are those in?
Well, there's actually 2 sources. One of them is from a later Christian source talking about this heretical sect known as the Nazareans, who thought that Jesus lived basically during the time of the Maccabees, which was about a century earlier than Herod. And also it's these Jesus as presented in Jewish sources, including the Talmud.
Wow. So we have all kinds of options for dates. We have no known objects that behave this way in the sky. Is there something else that you came up with that kind of makes the story believable in any way?
Oh, well, believable is literature.
Yeah, it was written down. So, I mean, it's a fun story, but that seems like that's just about it, right?
Yeah, well, the arguments become interesting in a couple ways. One is all of the various attempts to look at the original language and see, is there some other hidden meaning? In particular, there's been a lot of attempts to look at a particular Greek word or phrase or say, oh, actually this is an astronomical term. And if we put it in that context of how astronomers and astrologers use this, like, oh, they're talking about things like retrograde motion. So normally the planets move against the background stars going west to east, but occasionally they slow down, stop, reverse direction, then stop and go back again. When the planets are moving east to west versus the background stars, we call that retrograde. And people are claiming, oh, that's the same word here used in Matthew, and so that's what he's actually talking about. And when they say stop, that's the stopping of the planets in the sky. So it's a clever interpretation or reinterpretation of the text, unless you can actually read Greek and you realize, wow, these people have no idea what they're talking about.
Well, not only that, but retrograde motion of the planets is experienced on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. It doesn't happen over minutes and look obvious in the sky. I mean, you could sit and watch all night, and you probably wouldn't notice this at all in a given night, correct?
Precisely so, that there was no way you could detect it in the couple of hours walk between Jerusalem and Bethlehem when the star was supposed to, as the text says, went before the wise men and then stood. The time frame for that is at most a couple hours, because if you're just limping along, Bethlehem is only like several miles away. So, yeah, there's no way this could have been a noticeable change in position and stopping of the star. Even ancient sources said, yeah, we can't even predict to when these things should happen within a few hours. So it's an absurd thing to either predict or observe, and also it doesn't fit the context because, again, the story is talking about the star going before, not the stars in the sky, but before the wise men themselves. So a little bit of geography, because everyone loves geography.
Yeah. Now,
Jerusalem is north of Bethlehem, so the wise men have to walk southernly. The stars go from east to west. They don't go south. There's no way a star can travel south in any noticeable way and then stop in place. It's, again, it requires these astronomers and physicists to completely disregard something that we care so much about, reference frames, and just not care about the reference frame as established by the story.
Now, I can't remember if I have the right city, but is there some discussion or debate about whether Bethlehem actually existed at that time? Maybe I have the wrong city.
Well, there is one archaeologist who does work for the Israel Antiquity Authority. He wrote an article about a decade ago in Archaeology magazine saying, hey, the archaeological record indicates that, like, for nearly 1,000 years, Bethlehem apparently was uninhabited, including the time when Jesus was supposed to have, been born there. And I haven't yet seen anyone refute that, show why that's wrong. But on the other hand, I also haven't seen this in normal peer-reviewed things. Archaeology magazine is more of a popular press, so I'm a little bit reluctant to jump on it, but considering the point that's saying, like, yeah, we have literally no archaeological data for centuries, I mean, not a potsherd from that time in that place, it makes me think, yeah, this could also be a problem that there may not have been a Bethlehem to have a star of.
Yeah, it's a star hovering over a piece of desert, which, just doesn't make a great story. And, of course, there's no inns in the middle of the desert, so it kind of ruins everything.
Yeah. I don't use that particular thesis point in my book just because, again, it doesn't seem to be something I can verify as like a mainstream archaeological view. But since I've also haven't seen it refuted, all I can say is this is a huge red flag, and I want someone to at least address it.
Well, it's curious if we can't really know for sure if there was a city. How can we know there was a light in that location above it? That the whole thing is just goofy. I know that you also do other talks. You've had a talk on basic astronomy, and you also cover astrology. I'm assuming, and I know already because I saw part of the video. You're not the biggest fan of astrology. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Well, first off, it's surprising that I know as much astrology as I do, just because of the research on the Star of Bethlehem stuff.
Yeah.
But okay, so first off, if you are traveling with someone and they say they're an astronomer, the thing you can do to piss them off, almost guaranteed, is ask them, what their star sign is.
Well, my favorite always was when I would tell people I was going to study astronomy. They'll say, "Oh, you were going to study astrology?" Because they don't make it that big of a distinction. I mean, and for a long period in time, there wasn't that great of a distinction. But in the modern world, they're very, very different things. And if I understand correctly, because of precession, the wobble of the Earth, the sun is not actually in the house that a lot of astrologers claim it is on any given day. Is that true?
This is where some skeptics will make a mistake, because astrologers do know this. And the thing is, a house and a constellation aren't the same thing to an astrologer.
Oh, Lord.
So first off, there's the problem that all of the houses are equal in size, but the constellations of the zodiac aren't. Like Virgo is gigantic, Aries is tiny by comparison, but they're both the same size to the astrologer. And so
one could
quite
also
literally, astrology doesn't have that much to do with the actual stars in the sky, but instead the ones they just postulate in their calculations, that don't physically exist.
and I think, I'm really drawn back here in my days of astronomy, because I had actually had an astronomy class and a planetarium in my high school. And there a total of 14 constellations that actually go into the band of the sky that's known as the equatorial region?
Through what's usually called the zodiac.
Yes.
Yeah. I usually hear it as like 13 constellations. They're the 12 traditional, and then Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer. But again, most astrologers stick with 12 traditionally, and the reason there's 12 in the first place is the number 12 pops up a lot. There's 12 months in a year.
Yeah,
so
it's a magical number. Yeah.
There's at least a logic to it, because in a given calendar year, a solar year, there are 12 complete periods of the moon, like 12 full moons usually, and then maybe occasionally a 13th.
Right.
And that's literally where the word month comes from. It's month.
Month. So from the moon then. But
yeah.
So does that mean the word 12 comes from 2 and 10? Oh, wait, that doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. But yeah, quite literally, the reason we have as many months as we do is because of our obsession with the moon. And I mean, our calendar is pretty much completely solar, but the Jewish calendar, Chinese calendar is a combination of the lunar and solar one. So it gets, I believe in California, they call it hella complicated.
Well, I know, I mean, if I'm living several thousand years ago and, we're living our life based on the seasons, and it's very, very critical to know when the seasons are, it's still a very long period of time a year.
Yes.
A month is something you can kind of, judge, and the moon will help you keep pace because you have the first quarter and the full moon and the third quarter. So you can kind of really measure things, and which might be why weeks are about 7 days, because that's 1/4 of the moon cycle. But it's an interesting thing, and it's very easy to keep track of. It's interesting that they never had the moon involved with the whole birth story, because it's involved with Easter, at least today it is.
Well, if you want some moon and Jesus, well, I don't know how avid a reader you are of the book of Revelation from the Bible. And, well, I mean, while the imagery there is strange, one of the interesting little stories, it comes from the 12th chapter, and it's gotten some notice recently because some people were just in the last couple months claiming that the prophecy of Revelation 12 just came true in the sky and the end of the world should be here. And it's about a woman standing on top of the moon, heavily pregnant and about to give birth, which, well, I haven't noticed seen giant ladies on the moon, but that's what the vision's about.
Yeah. And they think that came true. Why?
That's a good question.
Oh, okay. Because I was.
It's supposed to be. I think Jupiter was supposed to then be the king that's being born, and this is happening in the constellation Virgo. And Virgo is then the woman. The moon is then in Virgo with Jupiter. This happens kind of rarely. It's fairly periodic, but nonetheless, it was this weird interpretation of it. Somebody running some basic planetarium software saying, this is about to happen. And this must be the prophecy. Prepare for the end of the world again.
Yeah, I've been tracking end of the world prophecies for a while, and And correct me if I'm wrong, everyone so far has been wrong.
I'm just going to double check my list. Nope, can't find any exceptions. Yep, I think we're still here.
Yeah. So that's not a very good track record for prophecies, but it's one of those things. And of course, again, listeners, the book is The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View. And where can we find you? I mean, are you on Facebook and Twitter and those usual suspects?
Yes, I have Facebook, Twitter. I have a somewhat inactive YouTube account, website, draaronadair.com. And of course, I'm continuously trying to be as self-promotional as possible and love speaking engagements, children's parties, those sorts of things.
Well, I was just going to say, actually, because one of the focuses of my show, as you probably know, is about conferences. So if someone is organizing a conference or working on a big national conference, are you able and willing to show up somewhere and speak?
Absolutely. And while, of course, my hobby horse has been continuously over and over again, this very admittedly narrow subject, it does actually hit hard on the entire topic of science and religion, which I've written academic works related to that and education theory related to that as well. So I have at least a pretty good bag of tricks, except for the whole tying animal balloons. I can't do that yet.
We'll have to work on that. Is there anything else about the book that you want to hit on before we wrap up?
Well, I will say this much, that it has gotten a fair bit of scholarly attention. I was actually at a conference a couple of years ago on the very subject of the star that was hosted by the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and met a lot of really intelligent, well-versed scholars. And fortunately, they didn't laugh me out of the room. If anything, they respected my work. And I was actually the third speaker there. And after I gave my quick presentation and pretty much took down all the arguments, I sat down. A person next to me said, "Okay, I think we're done now."
Yeah, you just fucking killed the conference, douchebag. That's nice.
Yeah. So yeah, I would say at least this much, that it's gotten some good respect. And that conference, produced its own giant volume. But of course, like most academic works, it's you can either buy the book or you can pay the rent.
Right. So listeners, if you're in charge of a conference, please contact Dr. Aaron Adair. And do you have an email we can give out?
Yes. Best way to contact me is adairaar@gmail.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Phil Ferguson Show and explaining to me and my listeners that Jesus probably doesn't exist. You broke all of our hearts.
I'm sorry, but hey, there is still a reason for the season. It just happens to be the sun.
It is the sun and the the winter solstice, and of course, friends and family are always a nice reason to get together. So, Aaron, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, and have a not so blessed holiday.
Very good, sir. Have a good evening.
A lot of people come up here and they thank Jesus for this award. I want you to know that no one had less to do with this award than Jesus. He didn't help me a bit. If it was up to him, Caesar Milan would be up here with that damn dog. So all I can say is, suck it, Jesus. This award is my God now.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
Well, hopefully you learned something new about Jesus stories. It's always good fun to think about nice, fun mythology. Yes, that's right, a mythology. One review here on iTunes, and this is from, Jum8 Uck. Jum8 Duck? I don't know. Whatever. You guys make funny names. Here it is. I'm so glad I discovered this podcast. I am facing retirement and am full of trepidation about living on a fixed income after years of working at a very flexible, well-paying job as a hospital RN. I finally feel that I know how to approach retirement planning with the right tools in hand. The skeptic in me also loves the other parts of his podcast, The Atheist Stories. End quote. 5-star review. Thank you very, very much for that review. I do greatly appreciate it. If you like the show, you can help me out by leaving a review at either Stitcher or iTunes. Those are the two places that I know of that have reviews available. So please do that. I appreciate it. Of course, you can continue to do, like a lot of listeners do, sharing the show with their friends. I do greatly appreciate that and love to have all the new listeners joining us on a regular basis. That's great fun. Hopefully in a couple of weeks, probably right after the first of the year, we're going to have David Silverman on, and we're trying to work on something special to entice more people to join American Atheists. We'll talk about that after the first of the year. Of course, their convention is coming up on Easter weekend, and I've already got my hotel booked. I've got to get the flight and everything else finalized in the next day or two here, but that is at the very end of March. And I think Easter is actually technically on April 1st, April Fool's Day. So the American Atheist Convention is going back to its traditional Easter holiday weekend. So make your plans now, clear your schedule, buy your tickets, whatever. It's going to be a great show. And of course, when Mr. Silverman is on, we'll talk all about that. So we're going to wrap up the show. I hope to see you at American Atheist Convention or some other convention that's coming later in the year. If you are putting on a convention or know someone that is, and you'd like to promote it on the show, just let me know. Send me an email. Again, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. We'll be happy to give you some time to talk about it. And until I see you in person, ciao.